Is your favorite emotional nakige something from the ever so popular key like Clannad or Summer Pockets? Or is it something quote-unquote Kino like White Album 2 or Cyano type Daydream? Or something a little more niche like Iroseka or F A Fairy Tale the 2? Well, in this video, I'm here to tell you you're wrong, and the best nakige is in fact Symphonic Rain, and it's not even a contest. I originally read Symphonic Rain about 15 years ago, so I did a full reread just to make sure my thoughts on the details of this retrospective video essay will be able to properly convey my opinion in better detail than the few times I've previously recommended Symphonic Rain on this channel. So, having said that, hello everyone, this is Ange, and this is my Symphonic Rain Retrospective. I generally don't care for super long history lessons on retrospective videos, so I'll keep this part brief. Symphonic Rain is a visual novel developed by Kuroneko-san team, which was apparently a specialized team developed by parent company Kogado to specifically make musical rhythm games. Sadly, I do not know much about the other titles by Kogado, Kuroneko-san, or even the noted scenario writers for Symphonic Rain on VNDB. Instead, the one thing I do know about is the English translations of Symphonic Rain. Yes, you heard me right, there were two different translations. The original was way back in 2010 as a fan translation by TL Wiki, one of the most prominent fan translators way back in the day. This is an amusing fan translation project, as this is one of the few where even if you were to obtain the title and its patch, you had to actively manually edit your computer registry just so you can run Symphonic Rain. Not something I would normally recommend due to how editing your registry in the wrong way can mess your computer up, but thankfully things worked out just fine. However, on that version, you'd have to read on the old school 800 by 600 resolution, something many modern visual novel readers would likely not like very much. Thankfully, in 2018, Komodo, originally known as Dejika, did a new official translation for Symphonic Rain, which included remastered HD artwork and an HD resolution. This is a great way for people to more easily pick up this extremely underread classic, and how I and various other fans of the original drafted people to post their thoughts during read-throughs in a small fan Discord server. If you want to join that link to that server is in the description. Anyway, as of the 2020s, this Steam version means you have no excuse to avoid reading this classic, and now I'll use the rest of this video to do a deep dive on the details of Symphonic Rain's story itself. Note that there will be spoilers all over the place, so if you don't want to be spoiled on story, you should definitely close this video right now. As this is a visual novel, something I feel like I should talk about in a deep dive is the visual aspect of Symphonic Rain. I've always had a personal hunch that a reason why Symphonic Rain isn't as well read as I'd like is the art style. Admittedly, it is kind of weird that every single character looks like a lolly and just generally looks unusual compared to the typical anime art style. None of them are made to be conventionally super hot, and at best look cute if a little childlike. However, to me, this art style was never an issue, and I just found it very charming stylistic choice compared to every single anime art style I'd seen up until that point. And despite all the characters looking like lollies, thankfully none of them act immature. In fact, I'd go as far as to say this is one of the most mature, realistic casts of characters I've seen in a school-based slice-of-life visual novel, at least in terms of personality and motivations. Another great thing about the general presentation is this is one of the few visual novels that does not take place in Japan at all. The city, Piovia, is clearly a fictional version of Italy with a lot of Italian-looking cities, places, food, references, and even the characters' names are very Italian-inspired. The fact that it's constantly raining, fitting in the visual novel name, is also a pretty interesting and unique secondary backdrop that you slowly get used to over time. The setting being in a music school is also quite fascinating, as it's something we never see in visual novels. Right from the beginning of the Common Route, many characters are scrambling to prepare for a graduation music recital as their final project. This always gives characters a really interesting goal to shoot for, even in the slower slice-of-life moments. There's always some strong character motivations instead of just mindless slice-of-life antics. Speaking of slice-of-life antics, I like that for once there isn't an obnoxious amount of the typical Japanese harem comedy. There's no annoying tsundere hitting, no overly perverted protagonists, no kohai begging you to call you Oni-chan or other weird stuff like that. As said earlier, all the main characters are relatively mature and to me feel like real people for once. This helps sell the inevitable drama that happens in every single route and makes me appreciate the slice of life build-up a lot more even on a reread. One of the things that may be hit or miss for people to even try Symphonic Rain is the music rhythm minigame. Even though this game was released in 2010 after popular games like Guitar Hero or the more weeb-friendly Osu, this music minigame is quite odd to say the least. It's one of the most frame-perfect rhythm games I've played and has an odd structure where you have to use the home row of a computer keyboard to win. I still find it fun as there are still things like scores to beat, but one thing you'll have to take note of in this music minigame is a necessity to determine whether you get good or bad endings for a route. Basically, you have to do well in recitals in order to get good endings, and if you fail certain parts, you'll get bad endings. Thankfully, if you do not want to take part of this music minigame and just want to enjoy the music and the story, there is a setting to auto-win every music minigame so you can just enjoy the story as is and always get the good endings. You can't skip the songs entirely, but the songs are so good and the lyrics thematically resonant for the characters that I don't mind that I can't skip them. You may be wondering why there's a music minigame to begin with, and thankfully the context for it is actually pretty great. Chris, the main character, is actually a very talented but lazy user of this instrument called the Fortel. It's basically a piano, but noted to be a lot more magical. It's hard to describe, but basically it's one of those instruments where it's easy to represent your emotions when playing compared to a piano. But anyway, as said earlier, part of the goal in Symphonic Rain is the main character, Chris, has to do a graduation recital concert for his music school final, and he needs to find a vocal partner for him to do this little performance. Vocal students do not need a Fortel partner to do their solo graduation final. However, considering that Fortel players are kind of a rarity and sorta seen as celebrities, a vocal student performing alongside of one of them would be seen as a blessing. Chris is constantly hounded by his childhood friend Torta and his teacher Cordell to find a vocal partner before his graduation concert. And since Chris is relatively lazy and keeps putting things off, part of the goal too as a reader is to get Chris to finally choose somebody. Generally, the choice system relates to this aspect of choosing which vocal partner heroine to partner with. Similar to many old school dating sims or visual novels back in the day, you have this map system where you choose which area you need to practice your Fortel skills and or find a vocal partner. Generally, you just want to keep picking the place that has the vocal partner heroine of your choice, but if that option isn't available, you just have to pick one of the other options until the one you want comes available. Another fascinating part about the general presentation in the common route is the fact that for once, the main character, Chris, actually has a girlfriend with his childhood friend Arietta Fine, or how she's generally called Arie. This is a really fascinating choice as they have a long distance relationship at the start of the story and constantly send letters to each other. When you consider the fact that Chris's vocal partner may potentially be a new romantic relationship, does factor in potential NTR, which some people may be wary of, but thankfully this oddly never becomes overdramatic in the NTR cuckoldry aspect. Usually Chris breaks up with Arya right before getting with one of the other heroines in question. But regardless, the fact that Chris already has a girlfriend at the start of the story makes some really interesting dynamics and interactions that I've not seen in any visual novel in the 15 years I've been reading. One final thing about the presentation factor. While this game is generally about the music, there's a surprisingly good talent of known voice actor Seiyu in this game. For example, Mai Nakahara, who voices both twins Aria and Torta, has done very big popular roles like Nagisa from Clannad and Rena from Higurashi. Music teacher Cordell is voiced by Yu Asakawa, a very prolific eroge actress, voicing Ryder from Fate Stay Night, Momoyo from Machikoi, and all the main heroines from Cyanotype Daydream. Lise's voice actress Fumiko Orikasa is generally more prolific in the anime world, with roles like Rukia from Bleach, Cetus Victoria from Hellsing Ultimate, and Riza Hawkeye in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Anyway, that's enough about the presentation and the common route. I want to now get into the actual heroines and their respective routes. But the first heroine that I did was Falsita Fawcett, commonly nicknamed Fal. Oh boy, this is one of the most unique heroines I've seen in a visual novel to date, but you won't get to see her secret side until much later. When you first meet her, she is one of the few people that offers Chris an umbrella. Despite the fact that it's always raining around school, no one uses an umbrella for some reason, including Chris, so he usually just has to take the rain, but Fal from their first meeting is oddly assertive in wanting to help Chris and clearly wants to be his partner for the Fortel plus vocal final graduation concert. Once Chris and Fal start practicing together, Fal continues to be assertive in terms of being excited to be able to practice with Chris, almost like she seems to know how good he is at the Fortel. There's a particular sprite she has where she's blushing profusely while having her hand on her face, which kind of made me assume she's low-key yandere. But anyway, as far as we know, she's just a chill, yet focused, diligent vocal singer who seems to be particularly excited to perform with a Fortel player, which is understandable since, as I said earlier, Fortel players have a level of prestige in this Piovia music school. Speaking of ensemble practices, one thing that I have to heavily commend Symphonic Rain for is the execution of their vocal insert songs for each of the main heroines. Not only are they catchy, not only do they fit the characters' personality and tone, but the lyrics themselves actually have a lot of foreshadowing or straight up direct references to the heroine's true personality and route drama. With Fal's song Musique of Rain, I think it's probably the hardest to analyze from a lyrical standpoint when reading for the first time. It seems like she's talking about how she wants to be nice but also to be noticed. Once again, hers will definitely make a lot of sense by the end of her route, which I will definitely point out once we reach a certain point. Of all the heroines, Fal is definitely the most studious in terms of music theory. Right after their first practices, Fal is able to point out very specific nitpicks that she and Chris can fix on their performance together, to the point where Chris points out that they are the same criticisms that his own teacher, Cordell Sensei, makes to him. Fal invites Chris to eat some food on the house at her part-time job at a trattoria, which I believe is just an Italian restaurant. When Chris gives his nightly update to his fairy partner, Forney, about what he does every day, she is openly weirdly against Chris hanging out with Fal, specifically pointing out she's acting way too nice to him, which is interesting, because in every other route, she's much more open to hanging out with the other two main heroines, Lise and Torta, for different reasons. But Chris decides to eat with Fal regardless, and as she promised, she treats him to some lasagna that she apparently makes herself and is actually fully free as said. The food is already ready by the time Chris gets there. Forney may have a point that Fal is probably being a bit overly nice here, but hey, who can't beat some food, am I right? Especially since Fal seems to be pretty nice enough. After about a week of practicing together, Chris sees Fal doing some part-time schoolwork that people on the school staff apparently assigned to her. I stated earlier she seems to be very musically studious and talented to the point she can write scores on hand in big numbers with no issue. Even though Chris offered to help her, Fal doesn't really have much room to do, so he ends up just being entertainment as she's working, but she's clearly having fun just Chris being around, so she doesn't mind. During some slice of life map character select screen choices, you get to a point where Chris has to break his routine of eating lunch with his childhood friend Torta. This leads to a scene where Fal and Torta talk to Chris at the same time, and the topic of who gets to eat lunch with Chris becomes the main point. Naturally, for this route, we're going to choose the choice that leads to eating with Fal, and this scene kind of reminds us that Fal is apparently pretty popular in school, especially since she was apparently the previous student council president. After a few more days of practicing, Chris and Forney end up having another conversation about Fal, which leads to Forney wanting to accompany Chris as he chooses to eat dinner at the trattoria that Fal works at. This leads to some conversations in a way of Forney wanting to kind of test to see how much she approves of Fal, while Chris is talking to Fal while ignoring Forney. This leads to some conversation about how the two are going to practice more on the weekend, leading to the two agreeing to practice at Chris's house tomorrow afternoon. When tomorrow comes and Fal comes over and the two practice a bit, Fal decides to make Chris some dinner, showing that she seems to enjoy cooking and continues to be grateful to Chris for practicing with her. She also notes that she continues to work because she needs money owing to her diligent nature. A few days later, there's a scene where Chris and Fal bump into Asino, who's Chris's best friend, and Asino is practicing with a potential vocal candidate, and he considers retracting his promise to walk this vocal partner home to talk with Chris instead. But surprisingly, he gets told off by Fal of all people to continue his initial promise with the girl. A minor development, but something to note for both characters for the future. Fal decides to invite Chris again to play at her apartment, and there's some interesting interactions and narration as Fal offers to cook for him again after practicing. Chris seems to take an interest in how she keeps doing things because people keep asking her to, clearly making him feel bad for her in a way he slowly becomes interested in her and potentially lowering her burden later on. In Piovia, there's a holiday called Natale, which is basically just the in-game Italian way of referring to Christmas Day, as it is December 25th. The two initially planned on going to church to pray. Yes, there's actual Christians in this visual novel. However, Fal previously invited Chris to a concert that's similar to the music they plan on playing at the graduation recital. They have to get out of line to pray at a church early just to make it to the concert. This just shows how dedicated Fal is to her music, to the point she makes Chris ditch his yearly traditional prayers. During a break in the concert, Chris notices that Fal seems weirdly distant during the concert. It's to the point where he wonders if she's even actually enjoying this concert, but we don't get to learn what she was thinking until a little bit later. Fal decides to break the rules again and take Chris to school immediately after this concert, and convinces a guard for them to temporarily use their own school's performance room, where Fal talks about what she was thinking earlier during the concert. It seems Fal really wants to be a professional singer, to the point of being unable to enjoy the concert they are watching. All she can think about is how her levels are nowhere near close to professional yet. It gets to a point where she requests Chris to do a little practice on the spot. Since Fal has to go on vacation after this for supposed family reasons, Chris decides to just practice with Forney every day in his house for about a week until Fal comes back. I haven't talked too much about this yet, but I really like the interactions between Chris and Forney here, because despite the fact that she's a supernatural being, She kind of feels like a housemate where they can just enjoy music together. But they have interactions that feel like an old married couple with teasing and nagging, but also understanding of each other's feelings. A few days after the New Year starts, for some reason Asino invites Chris out to eat lunch together to talk about something. This interaction is noted to be odd, and indeed, in the other few routes, Asino isn't obviously frustrated and that particularly interested in Chris's relationship with Fal. When Fal comes back from vacation, she immediately requests Chris to practice at her apartment again, and she shows that she was practicing her vocals during vacation. However, it's during this practice where a recurring topic of this route comes up, about how Fal feels like her vocals were missing something. Fal even straight up wonders if her singing has any value. Fal being this dedicated to wanting to be a good professional singer and clearly being the most dedicated to the musical craft of the main heroines continues to be an interesting part of this route, but also continues to add a layer of mystery to her character. I haven't been bringing this up much since there's already a lot to talk about in Fal's route, but as this is the first route of the game, I need to talk about this. As I mentioned earlier in this video, the potential of Chris having to cheat with his current long-distance girlfriend becomes a big topic a week after New Year starts. Chris is clearly showing less enthusiasm to Arietta, clearly showing more emotion, enjoying and practicing with Fal to the point Arietta breaks up with him through this final letter. I know we haven't really seen Arietta in person yet, so all we know about her is through these letters. This still makes me go,
well, this stinks.
I guess the best thing is at least this didn't lead to a dumb NTR overly dramatic scenario like some other titles would, like White Album 2. The day after this breakup, Chris is pretty obviously guilty and down about how he caused Arietta to want to break up with him, to the point where Fal even starts to catch onto his down mood while they're practicing. She doesn't try to impose on asking why and just lets the two of them get deep into practicing for the graduation recital, which is probably for the best at this current point. The next day, Chris and Fal practice at Chris's apartment, and after some practice and eating dinner, as Fal's about to leave, Chris and Fal decide to have a big talk about the two issues each of them are having, which is clearly going to be important with how close the relationship is getting at this point. Chris talks about how Arietta broke up with him, and Fal seems to feel bad and apologizes for being the cause of this breakup. Chris emphasizes that he's the one at fault and she had nothing to do with it, but in a way, it was indirectly Fal's fault, but Chris was technically the one cheating on her. Fal in turn talks about her past, about how she was actually an orphan, and that apparently a lot of students in the Piovia city are in a similar situation. Part of her vacation was going back to the foster home she grew up in, wanting to sing for the kids at that foster home, potentially give them hope for the future. I like this as a way for the two characters to become closer, especially after they're both not in fully mentally healthy states for different reasons. Just a few days after the Arietta breakup, Torta decides to directly ask Chris about the breakup, and she seems weirdly calm about it. In fact, the way that she asks if Chris likes Fal is so chill, almost in the same tone someone would ask a friend what they had for dinner last night. You would think Chris causing the breakup with her own twin sister would have Torta be furious, but once again, all she does is talk nonchalantly about how Arietta told Torta in private that she broke up with Chris. Super weird, but will make sense later. Later that day, Torta and Chris decided to go to Trattoria that Fal works at. Not only do they happen upon Fal just getting off work, but Asino was randomly there around the same time, with Fal just saying she's going to leave. Between Asino just randomly being there and why he's randomly been questioning Chris about Fal's relationship over this route has been pretty suspicious. Just a few days before the graduation recital happens, Chris is still clearly feeling guilty about the Arietta breakup letter, to the point Fal continues to notice and tells him to get absorbed in the practice and help him get over his negative feelings. Later that day, the two talk about the magic of foretell, more specifically how it's tied to emotions, and seems to be implied the reason why the foretell is considered more powerful than a regular piano is the emotions you feel amplify the power of the foretell music. Seems like a really random discussion, but it then goes to Fal going up to Chris asking if he's sad, and the two getting weirdly close, having an intimate moment but quickly separating. This is clearly a sign of seemingly mutual affection, but nothing comes of it fully as of now. A few days after this, with roughly 2 days before the graduation recital, Chris is starting to feel a little bit better after his initial guilt over Arietta's breakup letter. Weirdly enough, this causes a random practice session between Fal and Chris to feel less fulfilling than usual, as if something feels missing from Chris's performance specifically. A day before the graduation concert, as if to correct this missing feeling from Chris's performance, Fal invites Chris over to her apartment in what's by far the most memorable scene in her whole route and one of the most memorable scenes of the whole visual novel. Fal starts off by asking if Chris thinks she's horrible, then shortly after pulls him into a kiss. Almost immediately after, Asino for some reason comes to the door while they're kissing. According to the dialogue that happens after, Fal's apparently been manipulating Asino's clearly obviously feelings for her. Apparently, Asino attempted to use Chris to get closer to Fal, someone he was low-key simping for this whole time. But in a weird twist of fate, apparently Fal was reverse Unoing and getting closer to Asano specifically so she could have reason to get closer to Chris, who she supposedly fell in love with due to his superb Fortell playing. This is a wild thing to just learn randomly on the spot right after Chris and Fal have an intimate kiss, especially if you had no idea what Fal's true personality was. And what doubles is that Asano apparently isn't as good of a friend as he first appeared, talking smack behind Chris's back just so he can get his ideal girl as his partner. However, this isn't even the most wild part of this twist. Apparently, part of why Fal manipulated Asano to get close to Chris is that she wanted Chris to love her for who she was. A very calculative, manipulative person whose smiles and diligent personality were probably mostly fake to get the results she wanted. When Fal says a line that says when she first heard Chris play the Fortell, she knew that when she heard him, she could aim for the top and be the best possible singer imaginable, it was this specific reveal that made me go,
"Oh, the deception! The betrayal, man, you deceived me!"
Fal proceeds to justify this by making some claim that people naturally use each other, so what she's doing is technically not completely terrible. On one hand, I technically can see where she's coming from. There is a degree of transactionalism in relationships. But on the other hand, her over-the-top way of doing things just makes her the most extreme gaslighter waifu I could think of. And the craziness of the night isn't done yet, as Fal even offers for Chris to use her too. If you don't know what that means, well, for all you people who want more plot-relevant sex scenes in visual novels without the typical overly long hentai dialogue, then this Symphonic Rain art is what people want, and you are missing out by not reading it. The sex scene is quick, but does an effective job of establishing the now conflicting relationship between the two. Despite the rage-filled hate sex felt by Chris, and which Fal basically consented to, Chris surprisingly still agrees to continue to the graduation recital concert the day after as scheduled, despite all the lies, craziness, and anger. The first time I read this scene back in 2010 destroyed me. Keep in mind, this is the first slice-of-life romance visual novel title I ever read, where the only other two titles I'd read at the time were Fate Stay Night and the Question Arcs of Umineko. Yes, Symphonic Rain was one of the first 3 visual novels I've ever read, and Fal's Route was the first ever heroine route in a non-plot-heavy visual novel I read, with Fal herself being the biggest female liar I've seen in any Japanese-created media ever at that point. Suffice to say, this made me, at some level, at least potentially distrustful of all visual novel heroines from this point forward in the best way possible, to the point that 15 years later, Fal's great plot twist still sticks with me and was likely a reason why I got hooked onto the visual novel medium so early on, showing the potential of crazy plot twists that can only happen in visual novels specifically. As you can tell, I loved the hell out of the scene, and when I first read, and even on this reread, I got especially hooked now that I got to see the actual build-up of Fal manipulating Chris, Asano, and to a lesser extent, Torta and Arietta indirectly. I love plot twists like this that have a lot of clear build-up with excellent payoff towards the end. It makes future rereads a delight to read, arguably more so than the already engaging first time you read this scene. However, I have one unfortunate flaw about the scene, which also happens in other routes in this visual novel. If you've been hearing the background music, you might be wondering why, despite the heavy dramatic plot reveals that's been happening, there's still been mostly lighthearted slice-of-life songs. Unfortunately, Symphonic Rain's soundtrack is incredibly limited, so even in these heavy, dramatic moments, many scenes use calm BGM like this. When I first read this visual novel in early 2010, I probably didn't even notice since I didn't know the potential of visual novel soundtracks yet. However, rereading it now, despite still loving the scene, at some points I was heavily taken out of it due to the unfitting BGM, making me not take parts of the scene as seriously as I feel like I should have. Thankfully, the writing is so good, I can mostly ignore it, but it's still an annoying, weird thing that I hope was just due to limitation and not a specific design choice. On the day before the graduation recital, naturally there's still some bad blood between Chris and Fal since it hasn't even been a full 24 hours since the rush of events happened. It brings some interesting tension between the two, but one small thing I wanted to bring up is a really short and you may easily forget it scene. There's a character named Grave who Fal notes was the person who took her in for her musical talent as a kid. Fal is surprisingly direct, noting she heavily dislikes him and his daughter, but she quickly drops the subject. Let's just say this will be relevant in the next route, and honestly, after a reread 15 years later, makes me question the usual online route order recommendation of doing Fal's route first, as you learn who Grave is in the next route, and reading that route first can help make Fal seem a little bit more sympathetic if you were to do Fal's route second. Now that Fal and Chris are performing the final graduation recital on stage, I want to revisit Fal's character song lyrics. Earlier I pointed out how excellent the insert lyrics of each character song is, and that they perform and how it relates to their character development and depth. Notice how in Fal's song, the last part of the lyrics of her song says something along the lines of, Look at me, listen to me, love me, I'm right here, the real me. Remember the conversation from in-game last night about how Fal wanted Chris to learn her true evil manipulative self but still wanted to be loved? It's stuff like this that makes me love when an author puts little details and foreshadowing that you don't really need to know to enjoy the story, but if you do notice it, it becomes that much better because you can tell how intricate the author's vision was thought out. Shortly after the concert, you have one final choice to make. To decide to help Fal with the future endeavors in being the greatest musician of all time, you're required to say yes for the good ending regardless of your feelings on the matter. Considering it hadn't even been 24 hours since the reveal, it feels weird for Chris to immediately respond given the bad blood that got started. However, I do think this development makes sense given the buildup of how their relationship started and how he started to like her, and he's unfortunately a teenage boy going through hormones and likely still finds Fal attractive throughout all this, despite the anger he feels, and even copes by having narration about saying maybe it's okay to be used by her. Obviously not the smartest idea objectively, but at least to me, it makes sense based on what's happened up to this point, makes it so all the buildup was actually worth it. Chris proceeds to have Fal accompany him to his hometown to visit one more time before he helps her with her future. On the train ride, there are talks about things how Fal recommends he visits Arietta one more time despite the way they broke up, but she also breaks off half of her necklace shaped like wings to share with Chris. Fal was clearly attached to this necklace as she's apparently had it since he was an orphan, but offers half to Chris as a way for the symbol for them to fly into the future. This sentiment would be nice if it weren't for all the lying and manipulation she's done up to this point, so readers who were legit emotionally invested in her might be angry, but I have to admit, the fact that Fal can just do stuff like this nonchalantly despite all the bad stuff she's done to Chris in a way leaves me in awe that she's this dedicated to her career while still attempting to fit in romantic-ish moments. In the post-credits epilogue scene, the two are back and living in Piovia, and well, this ending feels weirdly melancholic and depressing despite the supposed hyped up positive words Fal gave Chris towards the end of the route. It seems to be implied Fal continues to use Chris as a foretell master by manipulating his sad emotions to help her move up in the music world. A pretty depressing way to end a wild route, but unfortunately, pretty much the only way this would have ended up if Chris does actually choose to go out with her despite all she's done. Almost feels like a Utsuge ending. But yeah, that ends Fal's route, and wow, what a crazy ride, especially at the end. The route had a lot of slice of life buildup, and I occasionally see people dislike how slow the route buildup is, but I actually had fun with it since, I stated earlier in this video, I like when slice of life just feels like the characters just acting like real people, not having too much in the way of obnoxious anime comedy tropes. As Fal is by far the most career-driven of the main heroines, her route having a lot of practice sessions and emphasis on musical talent made a lot of sense and helped keep the quote-unquote slower slice of life scenes surprisingly enjoyable to read, though admittedly they probably could have cut out 20-30% of the slice of life and would have been the same effect. But as I said, I love that Fal was revealed to be a scheming, manipulative bitch, because outside a little bit of gaslighting, both the plot and Fal herself didn't exactly downplay how much of a horrible person she was being. As I said earlier, she's objectively a bad person, but I have to admit, I was in awe that she was able to manipulate multiple people in pursuit of a career she wanted so badly what she considered true happiness. Fal is obviously far from the most waifu-y waifu ever, but as a character, she's very memorably done, and regardless of whether you do her route first or second, she makes an excellent impression regardless and is a great build-up for more great twists of Symphonic Rain and later routes. The next heroine route I'm going to talk about is Lysilcia Cesarini, or Lise for short. Of all the heroines, she's probably the one most familiar to a typical anime girl stereotype. She's basically the quintessential shy girl with no confidence if you make the choice to find her in the character select screen. You happen to find upon her singing a song in a relatively old, unused building. Lise attempts to run away but trips, falls, and keeps apologizing to Chris for being in his way. One thing that I found interesting was how Chris kept comparing her to his current girlfriend, Arietta, who I assume was also pretty shy. As Chris attempts to get closer to Lise, they start off practicing his foretell and her singing separately, mostly due to Lise's incredible shyness. We eventually find out that even though she's being particularly skittish, it's not that she's scared of Chris per se. In fact, there's a scene where she laments that Chris isn't showing up to the old wing like he usually does. She's just being really bad at stating her feelings due to just being incredibly shy or socially. I will admit, it's kind of frustrating at first that Lise keeps essentially running away and not being honest with her feelings, but at the same time, I actually really appreciate this approach because this feels more like a genuine way actual introverted, shy people might act in real life. In most Japanese created anime and visual novels, the typical shy girl archetype we usually see has the girl makes some kind of spazzy panic attack which can be funny at times, but it's nice to have a shy girl who's just a little bit more genuine, and how I perceive more potentially shy introverted girls may act around the guy they're interested in. Anyway, once you get on one of the last choices to finally get on Lise's route, they finally do an ensemble together, and interactions they have afterward is pretty wholesome. Since they did their ensemble similar to Fal's route, I want to quickly go over Lise's main route song, Lysine. Unlike Fal's song, which was honestly kind of hard to figure out what the meaning of her lyrics were, I think Lise's, at least on the surface level, are pretty easy to figure out. They definitely look like a metaphor for her shy personality, how she's secretly an optimistic person looking forward to the future. But there are much more specific meanings to these lyrics, which I'll explain later in this section. One thing that's kind of suspicious is a scene pretty close to when Lise's route actually starts. When Chris introduces Torta to her, there's a scene where he attempts to grab Lise by her hand to get her attention, and her immediate response is to attempt to run away and tell the person to leave her alone, only calming down when she realizes it's Chris reaching out to her. Forget shyness, this straight up seems like social anxiety or some kind of defense mechanism against potential abuse or something. A scene shortly after gives you more proof of this when Chris, for some reason, gets weirdly full of himself. He tries to have Lise want to perform in front of an audience in a free practice music room. All the other students weirdly leave quietly, clearly avoiding Lise, which causes Lise to curl up in a ball out of fright. This seems like the perfect example of the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Even though Chris had a nice idea of wanting to get Lise's confidence up, he got weirdly arrogant of the supposedly right idea to fix this issue without even knowing what Lise's circumstances were actually. It's frustrating to watch in real time, but also a very understandable character flaw which I hope to see gets developed. Shortly after this scene, Chris's best male friend Osino invites him to what's supposedly a special foretell lecture. This lecture is being done by someone who calls himself Grave Cesarini. This guy's definitely a character, someone we're gonna have to want to keep track of, and what I call a boomer foretell elitist. He only lets in what he considers the best of the best in his mind students to listen to his foretell lectures. Even though Chris is pretty obviously disgusted with his personality, since Chris is a genius at foretell, Chris ends up being one of the two people that gets invited into Grave's lecture. Even though Chris clearly hates this guy, he can't help but listen to this very well researched and spoken lesson on the history of foretell and its importance on that world's culture. Chris tries to use multiple people to find out why the heck he got the initial response of all the people trying to avoid Lise, and his bro Osino invites him over to a restaurant to basically let him know that Grave is actually Lise's father, and considering what we've seen how ridiculously strict he is with other foretell players, I think you can see things slowly starting to come together, which keeps the plot quite interesting. With this knowledge, Chris is finally able to talk to Lise again, and while he shows that he's now aware of why people are avoiding her, Lise actively tries to tell Chris it's impossible for them to be partners for his graduation recital, which really hurts because you can tell she clearly wants to partner with him because she has fun practicing with him, but obviously doesn't want to see Chris get hurt by her unpopularity. This is the type of subtle foreshadowing and character building that I wish more nakige did. Thankfully, Chris is eventually able to get Lise to agree to at least practice with them again, to the point where Chris is ready to tell his childhood friend Torta he finally has a partner. Curiously though, when Torta finds out, Lisa and Torta get into a serious talk about something Chris is unable to hear. Knowing what the context of what they're talking about is really fascinating to interpret on a reread, but just for the sake of representing this for the first time, let's say for the moment there's going to be more moments in the text where it's pointed out that Lise does stuff like preparing an umbrella in order to not get wet from the rain and stuff like that, where she previously was not doing stuff like that. Looks like Chris gets so much into practicing with Lise that once he gets back into a Grave lecture, Grave makes a very interesting comment about Chris making sure not to get matters which does not involve him. I think at this point, it's safe to say you're most likely not going to like this guy. But even more curiously, shortly after this event, Chris and Lise agree to practice on Chris's place that Saturday. However, Lise does not arrive until Sunday, 10 p.m., which is definitely quite late to show up for a practice session. But one thing that gets brought up by Lise when she does show up is she somehow got a foot-leg injury. Seems really random, especially when you consider that despite the supposed foot injuries, she still was able to walk all the way over to Chris's house. I think red flags should start swirling in your head, but
This is just the beginning.
due to things like Christmas and New Year's being a busy time, Chris and Lise agree to meet a little over a week after the new year. If the red flags about her leg injury weren't going off then, Lise, when they finally do meet up again, has a bandage on her throat with her claiming it's a cold. But I don't know about you guys, but I don't know anyone who's wrapped their neck in a bandage when they've had some kind of simple medical allergy or a cold. Even 5 days after this day, when Lise's throat starts to feel better, she still says she's unable to sing for some reason. She can talk perfectly fine, but is just unable to sing. So while there is likely a physical aspect to this neck abuse clearly, there's gotta be something more psychological, but we just don't know what yet. As the graduation recital is on January 10th, this is where the drama slowly picks up, with the two scrambling to be able to perform on that date. But more importantly, is Lise even going to be okay when you see stuff like this? Her super shy personality and clearly abused victim reactions make a lot more sense, which makes me, and I hope you the reader, feel bad for her. A few days later, we get this exact answer to this, and well, my first reaction is I want to beat the crap out of Grave. Turns out from the little exposition we get, Lise is apparently supposedly a foster child that Grave adopted, with the assumption that he wanted to pass on his elitist foretell skills and knowledge to the next generation. But he does so through abusive, extreme training through a stick on a person's throat, forcing the person to keep playing while basically telling them they are unable to sing. Man, these remind me of all those stories I hear about closed-minded Asian parents who force their kids to basically become a junior version of the parent, as opposed to what the kid actually wants to do. This depiction of parental abuse and the kids' reaction to it is so raw and relatable that I have to really commend the writer of Symphonic Rain. They could have done this in an overdramatic anime fashion, but it really felt down to earth and, like I said, raw and realistic, which is easily one of my favorite aspects of the writing of Symphonic Rain in general. But suffice to say, I definitely hate Grave as a person, but his depiction as a quote-unquote villain in this story so far is just way too real, and I have to commend it in some way. After Chris attempts to yell at Grave, he chases Lise, and naturally, he gets to see the physical scars on where her bandage is when she takes it off. If you weren't already mad or sad, I'll be very surprised if you didn't feel any emotions whatsoever during this scene. This is where Chris and Lise confess to each other and proceed to kiss a lot. Now, here's the first real criticism I have of this route. I don't know about you guys, but it just seems weird for an abuse victim and her savior boyfriend to immediately kiss right after he finds out the source of her trauma. I think I get the idea. Chris was trying to heal her the best way he could, which makes sense, but it feels like they're just forcing the romance too quickly. At this point, I get it. There's not too much time before the graduation recital, and Chris already broke things off with Arietta through a letter, and admittedly, Chris and Lise's mutual attraction was built up pretty well in the slice of life scenes. I just don't think this is the right time to have a romantic climax randomly, especially since it was just kind of exposited to us in like 10 lines before moving on to the next scene. But that's fine. We were able to save an abused victim for the time being with a wholesome scene to boot. Apparently, Lise is so happy to finally be able with Chris, she's able to assertively insist to Chris to sharing a bed with her so he doesn't have to sleep on the floor and she doesn't feel lonely. I still think they are moving this romance really fast. I do admit the shy girl Lise being open about sharing a bed with the guy she likes is kind of cute in a way, despite all the bad stuff that's going on. After the two basically hide away from Grave for several days, Lise eventually brings up she wants to retrieve the original score and lyrics of the song she's always been singing as a kid, which is the song they've been practicing and are planning to use for the graduation recital. Apparently, this score lyrics is in the Cesarini house, aka Lise and Grave's house. They purposely try to go in at a time when Grave is supposedly not there as he's busy with lectures or something. The idea of the story is to create a clear tension of them trying to rush to find the score and get out of there as soon as possible, though it takes them a while to find out where the location is, and Chris just happens to find it secretly hiding under an old foretell Grave used to play under. In a kind of interesting twist, it turns out Lise actually isn't Grave's foster daughter, but instead his actual blood-related daughter. But it's kind of convenient that Grave was just apparently hiding this whole time, waiting for the two to just find the score after several hours of waiting. I don't know, this seems just kind of weird. They're like a bunch of coincidences that just seem to be written off as Grave being a crazy douchebag, which, to be fair, he kind of is, but I guess the drama had to move forward quickly. Grave attempts to humanize himself by saying that he was a super musician when he was married, but his wife suddenly left him and dropped off their only daughter at an orphanage and found out this wife got with another guy who was just some random other singer. Based on how Grave was describing this, he just sounds like a really bitter ex that was overly strict to his family. All this is obviously said from his point of view, we unsurprisingly aren't given a lot of details about the other side of the story because obviously the wife isn't there anymore. I weirdly kind of like this because it kind of shows that abusers clearly start from a place of an actual sore spot or loss in their life. However, Chris isn't fully buying his sob story, and hopefully you, the reader, aren't either. Unfortunately, Lise is being frustratingly naive here, but admittedly, this is kind of fitting for her character. Apparently, Grave is now promising that Chris can be the one to take care of Lise if they can do well as graduation recital performance partners. As a reader, both when I first read this 15 years ago and also rereading it now, it's pretty damn obvious he's at least partially lying about this, but there's not really much they can do, so besides just them being able to do their best. Chris and Lise have one final day of pure wholesomeness where they do some practice and eventually do the graduation recital, which unsurprisingly goes super well and the crowd loves them. The two are naturally interested to see what Grave's response to this is, and he seems like he's a little bit more receptive to the relationship now, but when Lise kind of stupidly goes to her father's house all by herself to retrieve her childhood song score lyrics, she eventually arrives at Chris's house even more abused than usual. Grave also shows up to basically tell Chris that he was essentially at least telling half the truth, that he would allow Chris to have Lise, but Lise would in turn have to be robbed of her ability to sing since Chris is robbing Lise from him. The fact that this guy is getting away with physical abuse of his, we just recently found out, his own blood-related daughter, and is now just gonna run away and probably never see her again out of spite for not being his successor is pretty damn aggravating. I kind of have mixed feelings on the execution of this scene. On one hand, the characters are definitely in line with characters like Lise definitely being nice and naive, and Grave clearly being a douchebag that doesn't get power of love redeemed because he's clearly too far gone. However, I can't help but feel this ending being overly bittersweet was done through a bunch of characters acting stupid or barely explained coincidences. I like the idea of it, just a little mixed on the execution. This leads to an epilogue where Lise is hospitalized for a year after this abuse, where she's definitely unable to sing and is said to be incapacitated temporarily. I kind of wish this incapacitation was a little bit more detailed on what exactly Grave did to her, since it just seems to be extreme neck trauma with some psychological stuff maybe. Thankfully, the actual ending to Lise's route is pretty good, where the lyrics of her main route started to come into play. If you were paying attention to Lise's song lyrics earlier, you may remember that Lise's lyrics include a line something like, "The sun shines through the trees outside the window, and no matter what tomorrow brings, I'm not afraid because I live today now." This ending definitely overemphasizes these lyrics being applied to the ending because a year after Lise got hospitalized, she slowly started to be able to very hoarsely sing again that old song after Chris essentially played the foretell for her all this time while they were in the hospital. Despite all the bad stuff they've been through, there is hope because she is still alive, appears to not have Grave anymore in life, and she may be able to sing okay in the future. And this ends Lise's route. Man, for the supposedly good ending for this route, this was surprisingly bittersweet. I would overall say this route is quite good. Not quite as memorable as Fal's due to Fal's super mind-blowing unique plot twists. Compared to that, Lise's route was honestly kind of predictable towards the end, but as far as emotional, bittersweet endings, this is pretty good. I had mixed feelings on Grave as he definitely felt like a bit too much of an obvious hateable villain character, but at least his motivations were at least relatively human. Lise herself was pretty likable, a shy character that didn't have any of the typical over-the-top anime isms of other shy characters. I just wish a lot of the drama wasn't through her extreme naivete over believing her abusive dad. But sadly, there are people in real life like her around her age that basically had no choice and would probably do something similar, especially since the only parental figure in her life. Despite all these flaws though, I definitely still liked this route and definitely still left an overall positive impression on me, which is more than I can say for other emotional nakige routes I've read before. The next heroine I'm going to be talking about is Torta Fine, or Torta. You may have noticed that her last name may sound familiar. Well, that's because Torta is actually Arietta's sister. So basically one of Chris's potential main love interests and vocal partners is his own girlfriend's twin sister. The Aru and Torta were Chris's childhood friends. It means Torta is one of the few heroines who actually has a rapport with Chris from the beginning. Despite the fact that Chris is dating Torta's sister, I like that Torta kind of acts like a secondary naggy big sister, being one of the few to tell Chris to just get a partner for his graduation recital right away. Their interactions do legitimately feel like real childhood friends for once, with them being able to be really casual with each other, making snarky remarks while still very clearly caring for each other. One of the interesting things that is kind of consistently brought up in the story is the fact that despite Chris being with Arietta, many people keep bringing up the fact that Torta is better with him in terms of chemistry and seems like the better fit for Chris in terms of relationship. Based on Chris and Torta's interactions, it's pretty easy to see why. Chris is a generally pretty passive but very talented, while Torta is generally more outgoing and naggy, and is noted that she got good through singing through hard work. And as said earlier, they have great interactions, being snarky to each other in a friendly way. When you see their interactions, you'd probably be surprised they aren't going up themselves. There's an interaction when Chris and Torta visit the Fine family grandma, and the grandma Nina points out that the two's dynamic after playful, sarcastic banter. Anyway, once the route starts proper, after the two start actively practicing with each other, there's kind of an amusing gag where Torta likes to sing right behind Chris's back conveniently, forgetting to never make another copy of the sheet music to practice. So she always has a hand on his shoulder when he's playing, and he clearly looks uncomfortable, but she's clearly liking the close physical connection. Speaking of practice, I think Torta's lyrics of the song for her route are by far the easiest to understand, at least at a surface level. Considering that Chris is currently going out with her twin sister, literally the first lyrics of her song are about how she wishes she could steal his heart. There's other notable lyrics about the song related to the umbrella and the rain. Honestly, the fact that Chris doesn't catch on to these lyrics, showing there's some low-key sister jealousy, just goes to show how the typical dense protagonist works, but at least in that regard, it means he's being faithful to Arya, at least at the moment. Close to where the route starts proper, Torta starts to make more statements about trying to point out to Chris why he's specifically partnering with Torta, basically implying that Chris is only doing it just because he's dating her twin sister, who's in a long-distance relationship with. While the drama is up front, it does seem like it's going to be more low-key compared to what Fal and Lise did, but definitely still interesting and something to keep in mind for later parts of this route. Anyway, the two start practicing, getting to the point where Torta finally starts to go to Chris's apartment again. It's pretty interesting to notice that Forney seems particularly excited to have Torta be the one to visit, but also happy that Torta is most likely to be Chris's partner, especially compared to the previous two girls. After Torta visits for the first time in this route, one thing that's an incredibly interesting scene, especially on a reread, is how incredibly insistent she is on making sure Chris reads his letters from Arya. I get that Torta is Ariada's twin sister and all, but it makes you wonder why she cares so much. I get up to this point, she's shown to be a pretty nosy, naggy person, being one of the few people to tell Chris to get off his lazy ass to get a partner for his graduation, but her insistence on telling Chris to read letters from her sister seems kind of odd, especially right in front of her. Either way, definitely something to keep track of. Speaking of the twin sisters, one of the main themes of this route is the comparison of Torta and Ariada, noting their respective skills and weaknesses. More specifically, it's noted that Arietta is not good at singing, so she felt left out whenever the three childhood friends hung out together, but instead had more traditional feminine skills like cooking and such, to the point she apparently has a bakery job wherever she's living right now. Conversely, Torta is a great singer as said through hard work, but is noted to be pretty bad at cooking, or at least used to be, as Chris keeps making comments about how she's so bad at cooking. It's kind of interesting how they keep making these comparisons. I'm sure it'll be important. However, Torta and Chris talk about how Torta has changed to the point where she makes a comment about her and Arietta being identical twins with different skill sets, but apparently the fact that the two sisters are now heavily separated, they were able to improve the weaknesses that the other sister were strong in. So if it wasn't already obvious, there's clearly going to be a lot of comparisons between Torta and Arya as twins when there's the inevitable breakup, as Chris is likely going to go for Torta, which in a way will likely be a worse breakup since he's literally breaking up with his girlfriend for her twin sister. However, at this point, a lot of the route is just more slice of life relationship build-up and other random little factors that are brought up through the slice of life. How Torta is not actually a musical prodigy and had to practice really hard in order to get into the Piovia school. There's also a pretty fun event where Forney actually leaves Chris's apartment for once, going to Torta and her grandma's house for Christmas Eve, showing that Forney has a clear bias for the Fine family. On Natale, aka Italian Christmas, a bunch of things happen that aren't really that big on their own, but do help for some more build-up, including Nina, Torta's grandma, having previously given Chris and Torta tickets to a musical concert for the two, clearly prioritizing their recent musical partnership as kind of a pseudo-date, and Forney wanted to stay behind at Nina's house, something she hasn't done before. For all you Christians out there, Chris and Torta actually go to pray at a clearly Christian-inspired church and even refer to as Mass, references to God and the priests as Father. Though unfortunately, they're clearly not the weekly practicing type. They're the type who only go to Mass on super important Christian holidays. There's a scene where Chris and Torta get offered calzones by a local street vendor with some curious lines about Chris feels like he's betraying Arietta, but also the calzone vendor is oddly confused whenever the topic of the rain is brought up. The concert, which seemed like would be a big deal, ends up being a 1-minute scene. All this really did was just add more build-up about how Chris is paying more attention to Torta as a girl. I gotta say, even as a slice of life fan, it does feel weird coming from Lise's route, which had much more obvious tension and drama build-up way earlier on. Meanwhile, in Torta's route, the clear twin sister love triangle drama build-up feels like it's oddly barely being taken seriously at this point. But I guess as a wholesome slice of life fan, I can't complain too much, but some of this could have been reduced. After a lot of what feels like two slow slice of life scenes so far, we finally get our first true plot twist, we finally get to see Chris's girlfriend Arietta in the flesh, and she makes a surprise visit on the first day of the new year. She claims it's because she's been talking with Torta directly, implying this is going to be a surprise visit planned between Arya and Torta. The minute Arietta shows up, it's really nice to see Chris have a pretty decent change in personality. Up until this point, including in other routes, he's had a more indifferent, maybe slightly douchey personality at times to Torta. But here, with Arietta, I guess a more wholesome feminine personality, and obviously the fact that she's his current girlfriend brings out a more amusing, nicer side to him. Interestingly, the two go on a New Year's date, going through almost the exact same locations that Chris and Torta went through on Christmas Day or Natale, including praying at a church, getting calzones by the same guy, ending with Chris playing the foretell for Arietta for several hours straight at home, just because she supposedly hadn't heard him play it in a year. As a reminder, they are apparently only able to see each other once a year. However, as Arietta is preparing to make dinner for the two of them, Chris makes an accidental, insensitive comment. As he's practicing the graduation recital he plans on doing with Torta, when Arietta calls out to him for dinner, he mistakenly calls Arietta Torta. This causes Arietta to start crying. While this emotional scene is happening, we get a random fact drop that apparently Chris always liked the two twins and had to make a choice on which he preferred while they were kids. Looks like the twin love triangle runs even deeper than we initially expected, which makes the interactions between Chris, Arietta, and Torta a lot more interesting than the too wholesome to be true nature of their interactions. After some back and forth, Arietta agrees to let Chris see her off at the train station the next morning at 10 a.m. since she was supposedly only able to stay at Peoria for about a day or two because she has to go to work at her bakery back home. However, maybe slightly predictably, when Chris goes to the Fine house the next morning, Torta is the one that answers the door and says that Arya actually lied and her train was at 9 a.m., so Chris just happened to miss her. Unsurprisingly, this leads to some awkward dialogue between Chris, Torta, and Arietta through letters, though Torta claims that Arietta isn't actually mad at Chris. However, several days of this awkwardness and sense of uncertainty stays while the two continue to practice. However, on one certain day, Chris realizes that Torta has been overworking herself to the point when she comes to practice at his house, he has to force her to admit she has a fever and take it easy and sleep on his bed for the rest of the day. Chris buys some food and thinks of ways to hopefully let Torta sleep more peacefully. However, not being able to control her thoughts during exhaustion, Torta lets out the reason why she's so insistent on wanting to make a god-tier recital performance is because she just really wants to make more actual memories with Chris, even proceeding to state that she's romantically in love with Chris to his face. Now, given that this is Torta's route and Chris is still in a relationship with Torta's sister, this should be a twist that was obviously going to come eventually. Though I would say the more interesting thing is how Chris notes he kind of low-key knew Torta was in love with him, because he just randomly brings up in narration that there was a point where he realized he liked both sisters and ended up choosing Arietta over Torta purely because of his impression that Torta was the stronger sister while Arietta was the weaker one. After this confession, and after Torta gets better from her fever, several days pass with more awkwardness and practicing for the concert. We eventually get to a scene where Chris happens upon Torta trying to put a letter into the mailing box next to Chris's apartment. Chris inquires what's in the letter, and Torta essentially says that she wanted to tell her sister about her feelings for Chris, eventually to us getting a CG where Torta is crying out of clear guilt of potentially stealing Chris from her own sister, in order to comfort her, and in a way showing that he at least somewhat reciprocates her feelings. Chris hugs Torta under the rain back in a quick, emotional scene. Shortly after the scene, Chris finally gets the letter back from Arietta after the many apologies he's given. Arietta reaffirms that she's not mad at Chris, but at the same time notes she's well aware that Torta is in love with Chris and could tell Chris was starting to gain more openly affection for Torta as she showed more of her vulnerable side. Arietta indirectly breaks up with Chris, saying to never send her a letter ever again. Despite all the awkward events that have been going on, there is an upcoming graduation recital, so Chris and Torta has to focus on that. However, they do have some small conversations here and there that they're recognizing their mutual confessions to each other and agree that they'll have a big talk about it once their recital is all over. On the day of the recital itself, Forney has one last conversation with Chris in this route. The way she talks feels like it's going to be their last conversation ever. Forney continues to be increasingly excited that Chris is going with Torta and makes some comments about how after today she's going to disappear forever in front of Chris. This ends with a pretty cute CG of Forney kissing Chris on the cheek very quickly while on his shoulder. Once the actual graduation recital starts, this is the only route that does not have an actual gameplay of the final of Torta singing her song. Thank God, I swear they practiced this song with gameplay required at least 5 to 7 times, by far the highest amount of any of the previous routes. After the concert, Cordell Sensei, who's been trying to be objective up to this point, notes that the two are superb and could easily become professional musicians at this point. Chris and Torta part ways after this with the expectation that Torta's going to come over later that night at Chris's house so they can have a talk they've been constantly mentioning to each other. However, randomly enough, Arietta shows up again, and the timing is just as, if not weirder than the previous time Arietta showed up on New Year's. The final scene of this route is also just really weird in general. It feels like a test from Arietta to make sure Chris is actually choosing Torta over her, and she seems weirdly conflicted about it, seemingly willing to let the two get together, but at the same time making some weird faces about it. While on the way to their destination, I did like this one small comment about Arietta pointing out that Chris was the only non-direct family member to figure out who Arietta and Torta were when they were growing up, since they liked to play pranks as they were very similar looking twin sisters, switching up who was dressing up as who. The final, I guess you can call, test by Arietta is just when she walks to the train station. She claims he has to go back to her bakery job by tomorrow. Arietta says if Chris changes his mind, he should call out her name as she's going up to the station, and if he doesn't choose her, to just not say anything. Chris proceeds to not say anything, indirectly implying he's chosen the non-Arietta sister. And then the credits roll for some reason. Very strange place to put it, but whatever. After the credits, it's been shown that it's been several weeks after Arietta showed up out of nowhere, and apparently Torta never showed up to Chris's house a single time despite their promise to meet and talk after the recital is over. Just as Chris is ready to leave Piovia, assumingly to go back to his hometown, Torta shows up finally and says that she's going to go with him back to their original city, and leaves off with a cliffhanger of her beginning to explain what has been up with her and Arietta. Let's just say there's a reason why people say to read Torta's route third, as the route that unlocks next, which I'll be going through shortly, basically explains everything that's been going on weirdly between both Torta and Arietta this whole time. But with that, Torta's route is done. On its own, Torta's route is completely fine, but I would say is my least favorite of the first three routes. I've always known Torta's route was my least favorite, but recently I really remembered so little about it. But after rereading it, I kind of remember why now. On one hand, I thought the drama and character interactions were actually pretty good. I like the way the route builds up how Chris and Torta have surprisingly good chemistry, with all the hints of many characters pointing out Chris had been preferring Torta over his now ex-girlfriend Arietta. It makes the love triangle drama make a bit more sense. Having Arietta show up a few times is pretty nice, as we've only seen her in letters up to this point between all three routes. It was nice to see what she's like in the flesh after all the explanations of Chris describing what she's like through other conversations. However, of all three routes, I would say the pacing was easily the worst, with the middle portion feeling weirdly aimless. We know the route is clearly going to be about the love triangle between the twin sisters, but they spent a little too much time building up to that ending. And while the ending was certainly interesting, the fact that it left off on a cliffhanger for the next route makes it so Torta's route on her own ends up not sticking out as much as I would have liked. But as I said, the next route is what Torta's route was building up to, so let's just get right into it. Once you finish the first three routes and click New Game on the main menu, you'll get a new option, Da Capo vs Alfine. With the way it's presented, it appears this Alfine is supposed to be a true route of sorts, and, well, let's just jump right in and see how true that is. Alfine starts with a bunch of letters being read that are apparently written from Chris now, which we assume that means we're going to be in the perspective of Arietta now, which would be pretty neat since we haven't seen her in the flesh outside a few times in Torta's route. And that does eventually appear to be the case, until suddenly the narration starts to take notice of certain things before we get to a CG of, wait, why is she changing to Torta's haircut? Wait, so all the letters Chris has been writing to Arietta have been going to Torta this whole time?
You lied to me. How many other lies have I been told by the council?
And oh boy, this definitely is not going to be the first lie that's going to be revealed in this chapter, as this Alfine part has an extremely strong start, wasting no time as this is clearly Torta's point of view before the story even started. If you thought Torta was kind of a lie on her route, it turns out she's a much deeper liar than even expected when we start seeing things from her point of view, and she clearly feels guilty about it. She confirms with certainty that she's been Arietta this whole time, or at least while Chris has been living in Piovia. And we also get to learn that Tortietta was indeed the one sending letters, putting them straight into Chris's mailbox. You might have been able to catch on to this when you see the few times of her near Chris's mailbox in Torta's route. As this is now Torta's point of view, she's actually not voiced, making her a new protagonist of sorts. And we then find out Chris not only gets a sprite, but his own full voice acting. This is a really fascinating, unique twist, something I wish was done more often in visual novels, as many protagonists are even lucky to have a single voiced line, let alone a whole route where they get to talk. Because that's right, just about this whole route is going to be from Torta's point of view, which is really, really unique and super awesome. As we'll soon find out, we're going to be going through Torta's route once more, slightly condensed, and obviously seeing a lot more of Torta's inner thoughts and narration, which is really awesome to see. One of the first cases of notable unique narration is that apparently she's liked Chris even longer than her sister Arietta, his should-be girlfriend, and clearly tries to hang out with him as much as possible, showing little signs of narration finding Chris attractive in little ways, which I find pretty cute in a way. In a flashback that has a style of like an old 50s movie, we learn the start of Torta's lies. It turns out that Chris and Arietta were part of an unfortunate accident in their hometown, and Torta took it upon herself to take care of Chris and brings him to Piovia, assumingly to get away from the area where he and his girlfriend had an accident. While it's nice to see Torta protect him after this incident, she also throws in really selfish lines about Chris as hers now, showing that she's a very mixed person in terms of morality. She does show to legitimately care for Chris, but is more than willing to take advantage of the fact that her twin sister isn't around and potentially have Chris all to herself. This definitely makes out Torta to be possibly more than a selfish person, arguably evil. That just makes her more fascinating, as feelings like hers are pretty human. It's nice to see something like this being done in a way that's not overly dramatic that many nakige might fall into. So you know the many times that Piovia has been called the City of Rain? Well, it turns out that that was only until about 100 years ago in game, but in a really cool presentation way, we find out that Chris, while he's been in Piovia at least, has been seeing phantom rain. Basically, whatever trauma he went through caused him to have some kind of visual hallucinations, which I guess could be a representation of his sadness through the trauma he and his girlfriend went through. That's all we know so far, at least. This phantom rain twist might seem a little weird and a bit too supernatural, but apparently, through research I found, it is possible for people with schizophrenia to see visual hallucinations, including phantom rain. So at least something like that is in the realm of possibility. Certainly better than other supernatural twists of visual arts key that I don't like. After these huge reveals, the opening plays again, which gives me a good opportunity to let these new twists sink in and makes me explain the implications of so much stuff we've just learned in the previous routes. The fact that the route starts off with the Torta twist and the Phantom Rain twist makes you really question a lot of little things, and that's why throughout the video I've been making little hints about stuff to keep track of. Remember all the little times that all the heroines did actions that were supposedly due to the rain but was kind of inconsistent? For example, there was a scene where Lise did this exact thing, and if you remember, Lise only started to fake stuff about the rain after Torta pulled her aside to talk with her in secret behind Chris's back. This explains why Lise was always clumsy about setting up wet umbrellas and pretending being in the rain. And what we'll see really shortly, Fal having that one notable CG about her holding up an umbrella for Chris towards the beginning of the rain really highlights how far Fal is willing to go to get on Chris's good side. If it wasn't obvious about all the gushing I've been doing, I love the beginning of Alfine, and if you remember, this is one of the first 3 visual novels I've ever read in my life, and the fact that they were able to include multi-route mystery level twists in a seemingly nakige drama slice of life romance really opened my eyes to the true potential of visual novel storytelling, and this route alone made me excited to try even more visual novels after I was done. Once you get past the opening, we're going to be going through a lot of the same events of Torta's route, just through Torta's point of view, saying her thoughts about how she's been a liar, what she does to try to protect Chris, while also trying to be close to him to potentially romantically get together with him, but with her narrating her guilty thoughts and other small context clues for random little scenes. And of course, just seeing a lot of what Piovia is really like without the fake rain that we've been seeing from Chris's point of view. These are great to see, but going through almost all the same events would make for a really boring video. So I'm just going to highlight specific interactions that would really stick out to me, as well as a handful of scenes that are brand new to Alfine that would obviously only be from Torta's point of view Chris was never part of. So one important one to start off with. Remember about the constant comparisons about how Arietta was the sister good at cooking while Torta was the sister good at singing? Well, it turns out Torta has actually been practicing bakery with a private tutor, with Torta noting multiple times that she's only been building up these skills when she pretends to be Arietta once a year, which is pretty insane. It shows how far gone Torta has become to protect Chris from his previous trauma, but also how willing she is to build up her ability to lie to be with Chris and potentially have him to herself. It also turns out that Torta, before her route even started, was willing to stalk Chris to the point she happened upon that one scene I just mentioned where Fal first held up an umbrella for Chris near the school, pointing out how a lot of the students were noting how a guy and a girl holding an umbrella under a non-rainy sky was pretty amusing, but also continues to mind blow me how well thought out each detail of each twist was to the story. I gotta give them off their props for really thinking about every single slice of life interaction in terms of character building. Torta, being ever so protective of Chris, has her attempt to find out how Fal learned about his fake rain, and she confronts Asino, and well, let's just say my little comments about Asino being a simp for Fal turned out to be even more true than we even thought. He claims he just conveniently blurted out the truth in conversation to Fal in the hopes that he can potentially be Fal's partner for the graduation recital, as he's a Fortell player. This interaction also builds up the low-key bad blood between Torta and Asino we kind of saw between the two in Torta's route. Once again, showing the excellent character buildup this route has been excellently crafting so far. When I first showed the CG reveal of Arietta actually being Torta, you could just have seen it as a cheesy way of showing the plot twist of who Arietta really was. But a later scene with that same CG shows really interesting narration how Torta does it, because dressing up as Arietta oddly calms herself to get into the role and forget a lot of the stress she's been going through. It's narration like this, especially when Chris isn't around, that I really love how the writer's not afraid to show the flaws and how far gone Torta has come to protect Chris. But it's all done in a subtle and down-to-earth way and not overdramatic. The day after Torta finds out Asino was the one who leaked Chris' past to Fal, Torta straight up confronts Fal directly about why she's trying so hard to get on Chris' good side. Fal is at least consistent with the reasoning she had in her route. This interaction in general shows how hilariously similar Torta and Fal can be in terms of willing to be extreme liars to get what they want. In this case, Fal is willing to be extremely over the top of sucking up to Chris by holding up umbrellas for him, even if it means using his friend. Similarly, Torta is willing to lie to protect Chris from other people to the point of particularly having her for herself by dressing up as her twin sister. It's really interesting to see how different yet similar Fal and Torta are as their roles as super liars in this story. Fast forwarding through a lot of what I consider unnecessary scenes to bring up in the video, one small one I want to point out is one scene where Forney opens up the door while Chris is in the shower. It's really funny to see what little magical things happen in Chris's apartment when Chris is the only one who could see Forney. One specific narration that caught my attention is once Chris and Torta are already confirmed partners, when Chris talks about how he's enjoying the practice enough to be serious, Torta talks in secret narration how she's desperately holding back the urge to cry, noting that she knows that Chris still likes Arietta at this point. Once again, more great character build-up narration that I really like. One little detail that ultimately isn't that important but really nice to know is, remember that concert that Nina gave to Torta so she and Chris could go on their Christmas Day Natale date? Turns out, this ticket was actually from Miss Mayer, aka the person who was personally teaching Torta how to bake. A really nice gesture as a nice contrast towards the manipulative evil person that Torta has been. Another interesting narration during the Natale date is something we probably could have gathered by inference, but indeed confirming that Torta's been so dedicated to Chris that she basically ditched all her friends in the last 3 years to show how unhealthy her obsession with Chris has become. Really interesting detail to learn, along just the idea of seeing Piovia without all the fake rain. The day before New Year's, we get to see more of Torta's thoughts about how she's planning to dress up as Arya for the New Year's date. It's really interesting to see how much she's overthinking how Chris might react to certain letters she might write in the future. It's just too bad we already know what happens, because the tension would be really interesting if we had no idea what the outcome of Torta's dress up would be. Remember on the evening of New Year's Day when Chris accidentally calls the supposed Arya Torta by accident when they're about to eat dinner? Knowing the context that not only Arietta actually being Torta would naturally make Torta a lot happier, it's the fact of why she's crying and putting it in a completely new light. From Chris's point of view, it looks like he just hurt Arietta understandably due to the mix-up of sister names, when in reality, it was the result of continuous buildup of Torta really hoping Chris would acknowledge her as Torta, knowing she was dressing up as Arietta. Knowing that Torta was crying both as a mix of happiness that Chris might actually like her, but also through guilt that she's balls deep in a web of lies that she can't blurt out. Knowing the truth is just incredibly fascinating for scenes like this. I haven't emphasized this enough yet. I really like how this game is not afraid to show the gray area of Torta's mindset, simultaneously making her sympathetic, but also that she's objectively a horrible person for continuously lying and even going as far as to dress up as her sickly older twin sister. On the date after Tortietta cried, when Torta tells Chris about the lie that Arietta is going on the train at 9 a.m., it's interesting to see that Torta wasn't even entirely sure she wanted to execute on this story through narration, which is pretty interesting. It would have been interesting to see a branch where she would have likely kept it being Arietta staying at Nina's house. A few days after this, Torta and Chris show their current progress with Cordell. We find out what really happened in the small conversation between Torta and Cordell after Chris momentarily went away. Specifically, it turns out, unsurprisingly, this is a lie by Cordell, and she wants to find out what's been up with Chris and his emotions, so she believes that's why his playing at the Foretels steadily changed. Cordell also surprisingly gives some backstory about herself, that she's normally not a very expressive person, but as a previous Foretell player, she had a few moments in her past that some of the best playing in her life was after being rejected by her eventual fiancé. There's been a lot of implications about directly correlating emotions and the Foretell, but Cordell basically spells out the reason why. Chris sometimes plays really well as when he's extremely sad, noting that extreme emotions are what brings out the best of Foretell. However, unlike Fal's route, where Fal was clearly taking advantage of Chris's sad state, clearly manipulating things to make Chris even sadder, Cordell actually wants and believes Torta can make Chris play well by focusing on keeping him on extreme positive emotions, and believes that Torta is currently the only person who can do this for him. Man, I don't remember Cordell being this cool and reasonable. She might be one of my favorite teacher characters in Japanese made fiction now. On the day that Torta got a fever and they ended up having to skip practice by having Torta sleep on Chris's bed, we get another brand new scene, this time being a small flashback to when Arietta, Torta, and Chris were kids. It's a small scene about how Torta and Arietta got sick, and a few little more details about Arietta was not good at music. This flashback is noted to be happening during a lullaby that Torta hears while Chris is out getting fruit and stuff to help make her feel better. If you think about it, the implication here is Forney is the one who's singing as she stayed behind in the original Torta route. Makes you wonder why this flashback is showing up now. After a whole in-game month or so, we finally get to see another letter that was written by Chris being read by Torta. This time, it's clearly after all the confessions that have gone on while Torta was sick. Chris understandably being indecisive since he's now in love with both his current girlfriend, but now also his girlfriend's twin sister. And similarly, Torta is both understanding and frustrated that Chris is being too nice to both sisters, racking up her guilt even more. Once again, more excellent narration purely through Alfine's Torta's point of view. A day after this, there's an amusing route original conversation between Asino and Torta as Chris is still going through the tension about the unresolved confessions. I've already outlined how Asino is a simp already, but this conversation basically highlights it even stronger, with him noting that he was clearly interested in pairing up with Fal, but Fal only agreed to potentially pair up with him if he did well in the graduation recital without her. It's to the point Asino claims he got a first-year male partner just to show that he's committed to her. I'm sorry, Asino, but this is just asking to be cucked so hard even without Chris being in the competition. That said, Asino does also use the conversation as a way to show that he cares for Chris and Torta and the tension that they're going through right now. So a nice thought despite the negative aspects of his character. On the night after the official graduation recital in Torta's route, you may remember there's this part that Tortietta shows up and does the little test where Chris has to choose a name of the sister he wants to go out with. One thing you may not expect is, right before this happens, there's actually a new choice right before Torta leaves the house dressed up as Arietta. If you choose the choice to just leave right away without listening to her grandma Nina, the ending more or less plays the same way as Torta's original route, with just being a little more narration from Torta's point of view. It's shown as a good end on the Steve achievements, but when the other ending is called a true ending, this may as well be a normal, even bad end, considering how much longer the other ending is. If you go the other choice, this is the branch that leads to the true end of Torta's route. I actually really like this scene and forgot how good it was until this reread. Nina, despite her lessening vision, can tell that Torta is dressing up as Arietta and basically tells Torta to stop doing this, as this dress up is not healthy for either her or Chris, and to tell Torta to just be herself. I love this scene because while Nina has been a very supportive, nice grandma up to this point, this is the first time she actually gave sagely wisdom that actually provides character development to Torta directly, which vastly changes up the ending for the better. It brings me great joy that Symphonic Rain can make their minor characters like Cordell and Nina very important to character development and show overall really good character building. We see the difference from Torta's original ending almost immediately after this pep talk. Torta goes up to Chris's house as herself, and almost immediately they confirm each other's feelings in an instant kiss. What's interesting is from this scene onwards, until the end of the route, we are back into Chris's point of view, with him losing his voice acting and Torta going back to full voice acting. While it's nice to see the original Torta route events from Torta's point of view, I kind of like that it switched perspectives back, as this is going to be brand new content from here on out, and being able to see the emotions Torta had through her sprites and voice acting after all this development is really cathartic. Torta goes a step further and finally lets the truth off her chest in the best way possible. She starts by untying her hair, basically showing that she was the Arietta Chris had been sending letters to this whole time, and the person who was dressing up on those dates on New Year's and Natale. Torta also brings up the truth that's been heavily implied this whole time, that Arietta is actually comatose in their original childhood friend hometown, and that Chris appears to have forgotten this due to the trauma. Grandma Nina was able to provide the two enough money to buy train tickets as well as a car to reach the hospital once they get to their hometown. On the train back, they talk about many things related to the past, but most interestingly, once they get past the tunnel, Chris is finally unable to see the Phantom Rain anymore. Now we know the reason behind this Phantom Rain, seemingly to be implied due to Chris finally learning the truth and being able to have a heart-to-heart with Torta. His trauma is able to finally conveniently heal by the time they reach halfway to their hometown. This part is a little bit admittedly magically convenient, but it definitely works from a narrative point of view to speed things along. By the time they reach the hospital that Arietta was supposed to be at the next morning, unfortunately, it turns out that Arietta passed away just yesterday morning. Apparently, Arietta did not regain consciousness a single time in the past 3 years, and that she apparently felt no pain, which simultaneously makes things super depressing, but also kind of relieving in a way that she at least felt no pain when she finally passed away in peaceful sleep. Despite all the conflicts and lies about using her sister, it's nice to know Torta is not far gone enough to where she still clearly cared for her sister and is able to properly grieve for her. After the credits, we get a really nice CG and short scene where Chris and Torta do a nice eulogy song for the now dead Arietta, mixing Chris's excellent natural foretell skills and Torta's exceptionally practiced singing skills. And this scene ends Al Fine. Wow. This route was pretty freaking great. In the 15 years I've been reading visual novels, I've never seen a route as unique as this. Having a full male protag female harem visual novel, having 99% of the route being from one of the heroines' point of view with full original male protagonist voice acting is pretty crazy on its own. Being able to see all of Torta's point of view narration, all of the guilty thoughts she has, and the unique interactions she gets that we didn't get to see from Chris's point of view were just amazing to see. I like that the visual novel in general hasn't really particularly picked a side on whether you should feel sympathetic or hate Torta, as because objectively both parts are true for her. On one hand, she was protecting Chris in a way that he was clearly suffering from trauma for his now dead ex-girlfriend, but on the other hand, the fact that she was overprotective to the point where she made up a lot of lies, eventually prioritizing her own feelings, is definitely not the most morally good thing you can do, but it's still very much human and in character for her, especially for someone still going through the formative puberty aspects of their life. If the visual novel ended here, while there is still a certain character we don't know much about, Al Fine still basically felt like a true route in a sense, with all the crazy reveals and an ending that's emotional and resonant enough for me to feel like this could have been the true ending of the whole visual novel in an alternate universe. While it obviously isn't, and I'm glad it isn't, this is still a great route, as this was basically the first multi-route mystery route I've read in a visual novel. How well executed this multi-route mystery route was in an emotional nakige story is amazing, and got me hyped up for the final true grand route. Once you beat Al Fine, we finally get to unlock the true route, which is actually Forney's route, aka the fairy that's been by our side this whole entire time. One thing I've been purposely keeping vague is Forney's purpose in the story, outside the fact that up until Chris finalizes which girl is going to be his vocal partner, and basically his romantic interest, Forney will always be at Chris's apartment to welcome him home. In the common route, Forney is a nice, comforting presence for Chris to come home to, with her even being able to do some foretell practice with him since Forney's able to sing for some reason. What's interesting is that only Chris is able to see Forney. This adds a layer of a mystery of who Forney is, especially since at the end of every single route up to this point, as far as we know, she straight up disappears forever. Now, by the time the true route unlocks, you might be able to start guessing who Forney actually is. And on my original playthrough, I had my suspicions that she was related to Arietta in some way, but obviously had no confirmation either way. But anyway, to get to this grand route, you actually have to click New Game and go to Da Capo, not Al Fine. Towards the beginning of the route, you get a brand new narration sequence about a dream about remembering, or in this case, not remembering. This is going to be repeated a few times throughout this route and will be very important, as this eventually leads to a choice for you to have to specifically choose to remember. This seems pretty vague and mysterious so far, but given what we know of what Chris forgot at the end of Al Fine, I think it's pretty clear what this remembering, or rather not remembering, refers to. Shortly after this, after some interactions with Forney after this slight remembrance of his dream, Chris gets the idea to write a song for Forney. It starts off with just a melody if he kind of remembers as he goes off to school, which is a small but very important part of kicking off the plot. Funnily enough, when you get to the map select screen, for some reason you have to choose to go to the Sinalco area as the map for Chris to try to continue making the melody for his Forney song, but he has to make a realization that being around people is too noisy to make a new song, so he ends up moving to a practice room, which will be the future choice when wanting to advance to this grand route. Yeah, this choice doesn't make sense to me either, but oh well. But not only do you have to choose the practice rooms when they're available, another important choice becomes available once you start these branches on the bottom left of the map. There's now a going home option, implying that you go home early, which further implies this is going to be a Forney focused route. And focused on her it is, as this is the first new CG of the route, seeing Forney prepare Chris's towel for his fake Phantom Rain every day. Since Chris usually comes home after some practice with his partner, this is the first time he sees Forney climb up a drawer to bring up his towel, which is honestly a really cute scene to see. This cute yet wholesome humorous scene sets the tone for the rest of this route being exceptionally lighthearted compared to the other routes. When you have the option to go to practice rooms over going home, make sure to compose as much as possible so you can have the Forney song ready as soon as possible. Despite this route being pretty short, the route choices are just a little more strict compared to the others, and we'll see why shortly. During various slice of life scenes, Chris is obviously hanging around Forney a lot more often since he's going home early consistently, to the point where he starts to appreciate the little fairy girl who's been by his side for the last 3 years. This, once again, leads to more ridiculously wholesome interactions between Chris and Forney. I'll just mildly spoil this now. This grand route is my favorite route because I love me some genuine wholesome slice of life interactions, and this route is full of those in spades. After a few days, Chris eventually tells Forney about the new song he's been making, but for the time being, leaves out that it's about her. While she's impressed by the song, she's also worried about Chris wasting time on a new song instead of trying to find a partner for his graduation recital. Little does she know what his secret motives are. Chris actually invites Forney to be the one to write the lyrics for the song, continuing to be Solid Snake, sneaking in how he wants this song to be all about Forney. After the song slowly starts to come together, Chris eventually fesses up and tells Forney all about the song and that it's all about her. Even though before, Forney continues to be frustrated about Chris putting off potentially not setting up for his graduation recital, even she can't hide how touched she is that Chris is writing a song all about her. But she continues to emphasize she's most worried about him not being able to graduate potentially, so Chris is going to have to be a little bit more sneaky in order to make the main song focus of this route be about the new Forney song. However, Forney does not trust Chris, so starting the next day, she ends up accompanying Chris to school for once, something that, as far as we know, has never happened, so this makes for some funny interactions when Forney makes little comments to characters that clearly can't hear her talk. Chris continues to be Solid Snake, as even with Forney there, he tells his teacher Cordell that he would ideally like to use this Forney song for his graduation recital. I think at this point, it's pretty obvious what the end game of the route is going to be. Despite the whole point of Forney coming was to try to get Chris to focus on his graduation recital, Chris ends up bringing her to the old wing as he just felt like showing her around the school that she's never been around. Random side note, it's really sad this is supposed to be Lise's main building from her route, but Lise hasn't shown up at all outside of her route. It's really sad that the writer couldn't fit her in at least once in either Alphenia or this route. They were able to fit in Fal a couple times. Yet another day passes by with Chris, clearly avoiding finding another graduation recital partner, but this time, Chris is a little bit more open with his wants, noting that he wants Forney to come with him to his hometown after his recital, but also wants to make one last memory with Forney. Another small but really wholesome scene that Forney is clearly touched by. After several days of Chris and Forney hanging out together more often, especially at school, Chris occasionally gets more dream sequences this time. Instead of the dreams forcing Chris to not remember and forget, there seems to be more mixed messages of telling Chris to forget, but then not to forget. Really interesting build-up. A couple of days before Christmas or Natale, Cordell Sensei has a very important conversation with Chris, which helps influence the rest of the course of this route. She notes that while Chris was practicing in practice rooms, apparently people were able to hear Forney singing. This is clearly leading to Chris going from being unsure, but now more firmly wanting to have Forney be his graduation recital partner. A really fun twist if he can somehow make it work. Now that we know that Torta is the supposed Arietta sending letters, I want to just quickly talk about one letter that's specific to this route. Tortietta notes that she was originally going to go with Natale with Chris, but is apparently busy with something and keeps talking about how she wants to trust Chris with his graduation recital progress. I think it's safe to say that she doesn't really have much to do outside of practicing, so I'm guessing these errands are just her having a reason to not visit Chris in person while he's busy doing whatever he wants to do. Nice to know they haven't forgotten Torta for this route. The day before Natale, Forney finally finishes the lyrics that Chris assigned to her about a week or two ago, though apparently she actually finished it a lot sooner but wanted to put things off since she wanted to focus on Chris finding a graduation recital partner to not get sidetracked. As she woke him up first thing in the morning, they're both excited to just get right into the song. And speaking of, I'm going to go right into finally talking about Forney's song, Faye. I have to admit, every time the song starts up, I have to hold in the feels or else I won't be able to contain myself and continue writing or editing the script because I just love the hell out of the song. It's probably my favorite in the whole game. It's so cheesy, yet so wholesome, and the lyrics fit the tone of the route so far and how it'll end later on. As for lyrical analysis, well, I'll just let these English parts at the end of the refrain speak for themselves. These specific lyrics get me every time in the most wholesome feelsy way and I can't help it. But anyway, after they finally practice the song, Chris and Forney talk about how Chris is supposedly going to show Forney who his supposed real graduation recital partner is on the evening of Natale. Another solid snake sneaky lie that he made up after he visited Cordell Sensei. On Natale itself, as Forney is supposedly has to wait until the evening to meet this supposed partner, Chris and Forney have a date of sorts, going through a lot of the similar stuff Chris went through with Torta and Tortietta in her route. This includes some more subtle, wholesome interactions at church. More importantly, we actually get to see a CG of the calzone maker and accordion player Marco, someone who didn't even have a sprite or voice acting. As Chris and Forney sing along with Marco, Marco notes that he was somehow able to hear Forney's voice, which causes an awkward mood to start between Forney and Chris. When Chris and Forney get home, Chris finally directly admits who he wants to choose as his graduation partner. He pulls out a mirror, points to Forney, who asks who he's referring to. Chris responds with, "You!" Naturally, this gets Forney pretty peeved, as this is the culmination of Chris' ultimate solid snake lie, but Forney this whole time has clearly been all about wanting to have Chris have a graduation recital partner with a visible person, so she ends up making an ultimatum. She's going to disappear until he gets someone like Torta to agree to be his partner. However, given that Chris is basically incredibly dedicated to wanting Forney already, he chooses to just stay at home, hoping Forney will eventually reappear, to the point here he takes really bad care of himself after setting a really bad mood after their Christmas date. It gets to a point where he clearly has a bad fever and cold and he passes out. While he's passed out, though, we see more of this dream narration, which I think at this point it's pretty obvious is Forney, as there's a lot of panicky dialogue about how Chris is really sick after he decided to not take care of himself for a week just to see Forney again. I know this is a serious scene, but it's kind of funny that this is the result of the two's stubbornness, but this leads to a lot of really heartbreaking yet wholesome dialogue about Forney's real thoughts on Chris. Have I mentioned that I love this route for being super wholesome yet? It's through this worried Forney that Chris is finally able to remember the big reveal, Forney's direct connection to Arietta of sort. It appears that right before Chris was going to go to Piovia, he had an interaction with the real Arietta back in their hometown. A really wholesome romantic interaction about their plan of sending letters to each other, meaning that the thing that Tortietta continued had an actual natural starting place, so it's nice that it came from somewhere genuine. It appears the accident was an implied speeding car accident that Chris had to witness firsthand. As he fully remembers the dream, he starts to hear Forney's alternate song, "I'm Always Close to You," which, by the way, has even more amazing build-up to Forney's real character if you look at the lyrics. Once Chris fully wakes up, they have more old married couple interactions before a final super wholesome interaction of Forney finally submitting and being Chris's graduation recital partner. This means that Chris is going to potentially risk his graduation by performing with an invisible being that people may not even hear, but Chris gets to have one final memory with Forney before he has to leave Piova. Speaking of wholesome resolutions, within a few days, Chris realizes, wait a minute, if Forney is clearly directly linked to Arietta, then that must mean the letters he's been getting from Arietta are fake. Then the only one who could have written and sent those was Torta. So naturally he brings up the point to Torta directly, and being the nice guy that he is, recognizes the positive interpretation of this and how he made her suffer. Naturally, as we learned from Torta's inner thoughts from Alfine, she's most likely extremely conflicted about this development, but even she can objectively recognize that him naturally remembering this was for the best. I wasn't expecting Torta to get any focus since this route isn't about her, but I'm glad she does get something here, even if she doesn't really appear after the scene in this route, unfortunately. In-game, we get a whole 15-day time skip showing that Chris and Forney have basically resolved all obstacles, and we don't need to see any more slice of life before the grand ending. And actually I would say this is for the best, since compared to the other routes, this route surprisingly didn't waste too much time on random slice of life, since it had its vision and wasn't afraid to speed things up to get there. Now that the two are ready to do their graduation recital, it's pretty funny to see Cordell's interactions on feeling bad that Chris's partner didn't arrive yet, as we wait the potential awkwardness of Chris playing Fortell without anyone able to hear vocals. As expected though, Chris and Forney's concert ends
with thunderous applause.
and was apparently the best performance of all time, as Cordell and even Chris and Forney are confused how they're even able to get things to work as well as they did. However, things like that aren't a priority, as Chris and Forney have a job to do, taking a train back to their hometown. But it's still nice to get some narration that Chris was able to graduate even if he wasn't expecting to, thanks to some intervention from the teachers who loved the performance, even though according to the rules, Chris should not have won without a visible singer. Unsurprisingly, we get the magical tunnel that clears Chris's reign, but I kind of just expected that at this point. As one might expect, given what happened in this route and the previous Alfine route, Chris and Forney's mission was to visit Arietta on her comatose bed. If the route ended here, despite all the wholesome stuff that had happened so far, I think this ending on an unknown, bittersweet one would have been perfectly fine, as it would have lined up with the endings of the other routes. But nope, this route is going all in on the wholesome feels ending thanks to the power of fairy magic. Arietta is able to gain the will to live and awakens right next to Chris, albeit in an atrophied state as her body hasn't moved in 3 years. To say this scene is easily my favorite wholesome feels in the whole game would be an understatement. This is the culmination of everything this wholesome route has been building up to, and I loved the simple but loving interactions the two had at reuniting. The line that really got me the most was Arietta just mentioning a simple statement that she read every single letter that Chris wrote while he was playing Fortell in every route. For some reason, this really got me, showing that despite joining in on the lie of Tortietta and hiding her role as a guardian fairy, the fact that Fornietta was still able to receive and appreciate Chris's love just made me want to scream out the windows to let out the joy I felt from all the feels. And this leads right into the credits. There's so much to unpack just from this final scene. When I first read this scene back in 2010, I think there was no mistaking there was a direct connection between Forney and Arietta by the middle of the route. However, there was still that potential that Forney could have simply just been a guardian angel of sorts that led to the eventual death of Arietta or something. But thankfully, my prayers were answered, as Forney was just simply a magical singing fairy projection of Arietta's will to live or something. From an emotional and thematic aspect, this final scene is perfect. It explains so much context that I've been holding back from mentioning from previous scenes. Those little scenes that Forney shows just a little bit more affection than one might expect in other routes becomes that much more wholesome on a reread. There's a particular set of lines close to the end of Fal's route when Fornietta was clearly going to die, where Forney says something along the lines of Chris looking so happy while he sleeps, and her being happy that Chris was able to find a girl who could be with him. When I saw this scene on my reread, I had to once again hold myself back from screaming really loud because the scene had just so much bittersweetness and wholesomeness to it. Knowing that Arietta dies in that route and basically almost every other route, yet prioritizes Chris's life and emotions, is just extremely sweet and basically vindicates my belief that Dedede childhood friends done right are some of the absolute best archetypes in anime and visual novels. Even little things like Forney kissing Chris on her last scene in Torta's route is just as equally wholesome and bittersweet as the line in Fal's route, and I also wanted to scream really loudly on the implications of that on my reread. I've seen people complain that the end of Forney's route is a little bit too different from the rest of the routes, as those are much more bittersweet in comparison, and I can understand that. But to me, Forney's route is like the ultimate deserved payoff from reading every single route. When you think about it, even if it's technically against their wills, Chris is essentially cheating on his girlfriend right in front of her. Every single route does become eventual consensual NTR, but in a way, Forney's route being this wholesome with the best ending kind of validates that sticking to monogamy, even at the cost of some self-sacrifice and some perseverance, is the way to go. Just knowing Fornietta was the one being the self-sacrificial guardian angel of sorts in every route that's not hers is amazing, making her easily my favorite character and route. However, notice how I've been emphasizing how this route is amazing purely from an emotional and thematic standpoint. I have one big flaw that kind of brings down my overall enjoyment of this ending: the Deus Ex Machina key-like magic. If you don't know what that means, basically in certain key-developed visual novels, usually written or inspired by Jun Maeda, there's usually a true route that has some kind of supernatural way of resolving the plot to make it a happy ending. However, I find that in key works, the supernatural aspect is terribly explained at best and not explained at worst. For example, in Clannad, just showing me a lot of random abstract scenes about a post-apocalyptic setting is not good build-up for resolving the true route. Similarly, in Little Busters, just repeating "Secret of the World" a bazillion times throughout the story is not going to make a terrible explanation of how the true route is able to work jive for me. In Symphonic Rain's case, it's at least better than the previous two cases since, as stated, there's actual plenty of build-up since Forney is around constantly. But the fact of the matter is, in-game, there's no mention of magical fairies that represent a person's will to live, with the only reference to magic being the foretell equals magic equals emotions. To me, this isn't enough. As much as I love this route, it basically just felt like the writer wanted to copy off true routes from Ki and or Jun Maeda. In the Symphonic Rain Discord, there are translated side stories that came after the original visual novel came out, and one of them does talk about how the real Arietta as a kid read a book about a fairy named Fada, who had the design and talents that Fornietta took after, but didn't exactly tie in that the fairy world definitely exists in universe, so it barely helped, but at least it did help in the emotional connection aspect. But anyway, we have one super quick post-credit scene to go through, and it's once again a pretty nice wholesome scene showing that Chris and Arietta started a music school together years after the ending. And we get to see more amusing old married couple interactions, with Chris noting that Arietta clearly picked up some personality from her role as Forni, mixing what I assume to be her original shy, feminine personality, or at least based on the comparisons of Arietta and Lise Chris made. I always thought the implication that Forni picked up some of the nagginess and attitude from how she noticed how Torta had to deal with Chris, and it felt like a necessity to deal with Chris's sneaky and lazy attitude at times. Regardless, the final dialogue between the two is really nice. And that ends Forni's route. Despite my issues with the usage of unexplained Deus Ex Machina key magic, I still think this is easily my favorite route in the visual novel, because what can I say? I love me some wholesome slice of life romance, and this was this, but with some added, excellently done drama that was built up from the first 30 minutes of the visual novel. I don't have too much else to say about this route specifically, besides it's the epitome of short but sweet. It didn't waste its time, got to the point, fulfilled its goal, and as said, was emotionally and thematically perfect. Which brings me to my final thoughts on the visual novel as a whole. When I started a full reread, I was afraid I was not going to love Symphonic Rain as much as I did when I first started reading visual novels 15 years ago. I was afraid my increasingly critical nature was just going to uncover my nostalgia bias, but thankfully that was not the case. In fact, I love that despite the over 150 visual novels I've read up to this point, Symphonic Rain still does plenty of unique things that I honestly wish more Japanese-made visual novels did. I love that it has a unique premise taking place in a fictional version of Italy. I like the fact that every single character, major and side, all had a purpose of the story, were either likable or at least pretty interesting. I like the relatively down-to-earth nature of the character interactions with little to no obnoxious generic anime humor gimmicks, and that the tone and quality of all routes was consistently good, usually great. Over the years, I was not sure if Symphonic Rain deserved a 9 or a 10, but unfortunately, after the reread, I have to very slightly side with a 9 out of 10, because each route had a very specific big nitpick, which prevents Symphonic Rain being a god tier, potentially top 5 visual novel for me. Fal's route had some weirdly placed BGM bringing down the impact of certain scenes. Lise could have had better execution on humanizing some of Grave and Lise's actions towards the end. Torta's route could have used a lot less slice of life buildup. Alfina could have used a lot less rehashing of Torta route scenes that don't really add much besides a few new lines of Torta narration. And the Grand route could have had literally any technical explanation of the existence of magical fairies representing the will to live for the Fornietta revival. However, even with those nitpicks, that does not stop me from loving the hell out of this visual novel. Symphonic Rain is still most likely in my top 10 visual novels of all time. Fal's route still contains one of the most unique and impactful manipulative gaslighter waifus, while still making her surprisingly sympathetic. Lise's route has generally well-executed nakige tropes. Torta's route explores the potential of well-done childhood friend love triangles. Alfine is a really great character study of an extremely morally gray childhood friend heroine for a good 5 hours or so. And Forni's route has some of the best wholesome feels I've experienced in any story of any medium. I love just about almost everything about Symphonic Rain, and that's why I think it's better than your favorite nakige emotional drama. Unless of course your favorite nakige is Symphonic Rain.